Hello and welcome to the MIT SGM Systems Thinking webinar series. My name is Lois Slavin. I'm the Communications Director for SGM and I will be your host for today. Before I introduce Dr. Czaika, I'd like to give those of you who aren't familiar with SGM a little bit of background. SGM stands for System Design and Management, which is MIT's master's program for mid-career professionals. Offered jointly by the MIT Sloan School of Management and the MIT School of Engineering, SGM provides an education that focuses on integrating the technical, business, and socio-political components of complex challenges by using systems thinking. Graduates earn a master's degree in engineering and management from MIT. The MIT SGM Systems Thinking webinar series features research conducted by SGM faculty, alumni, students, and industry partners. This series is designed to disseminate information on how to apply systems thinking to address complex challenges in virtually any domain. Recordings from prior SGM webinars can be accessed and viewed on demand at sgm.mit.edu. For today's webinar, you will be sent a link to the slides and recording in about 1 week, along with Dr. Czaika's contact information. And now I'd like to introduce Ellen Czaika. The title of her presentation is Can a Life Cycle Assessment Model Aid in Sustainability Negotiations? Ellen, it's all yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you. As Lois said, today I'll talk about can a life cycle assessment model aid sustainability negotiations? First, let's start with a quick definition to make sure we're all on the same page. So what is sustainability? Many of you are probably familiar with this definition. It's from the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1987, otherwise known as the Brundtland Report. It goes, humanity has the ability to make development sustainable to ensure that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The next question to ask is, so how do we become sustainable? From that same report, a less well-known section of it indicates that sustainable development is not a fixed state of harmony, but rather a process of change in which the exploitation of resources, the direction of investments, the orientation of technological development, and institutional change are made consistent with future as well as present needs. We do not pretend that the process is easy or straightforward. Painful choices have to be made. So what's involved in these painful choices? First, it's usually multiple parties making decisions together, and negotiations are one means for multiple parties to make decisions together. Next, sustainability negotiations usually involve some issues that are determined by physical world constraints and some that are influenced by the parties or the stakeholders' interests alone. Sustainability negotiations also contain some trade-off and some win-win issues. Models, especially collaboratively built models, can facilitate integrating different kinds of issues. Many researchers have suggested that models help decision makers make sense of different kinds of issues, for example, those physical world and stakeholder interests and win-win and trade-offs that we were just talking about. Though some of these researchers have found evidence that decision makers are not using the models as often as the model builders anticipated. So in other words, there are more models out there that are not being used. So looking at collaborative model building as a potential solution to helping stakeholders and negotiators use these models, basically encouraging and enabling model use, these and other researchers have suggested that collaborative model building, so that means including the decision makers in the model building process, can help. And there are many case studies which provide in-depth research into the applications of collaborative model processes in the real world decisions. By participating in the modeling process, decision makers learn about the socio-technical system in which their decision is contextualized. There are still some questions that remain about the impact of not using a model in sustainability decisions and the impact of not involving the decision makers in the model building. So this study investigates some of those questions. We'll start by addressing two of these open questions. So consider what is at stake if the negotiators do not use a model in their sustainability negotiation. Or rephrasing that is, what is the impact of using a model in a sustainability negotiation? Also, consider what is at stake if negotiators are not involved in co-creating the model that they use. So we'll phrase that in the form of a question. What is the impact of using existing expert-created models compared to negotiator co-created models in a sustainability negotiation? I used serious games, or one serious game, to do this study. A serious game allows social interactions to be more natural. It keeps them unfettered, while still allowing researchers to control important variables, or in some settings to teach an educational lesson. They come in many forms, such as management flight simulators, war games for military training, and in the case of this study, role-play simulations. So the one used here is called the Cup Game. It's a role-play simulation that I wrote. It's involving 5 parties who are negotiating 5 different issues. The parties in this case, as the picture indicates, are a coffee retailer, a cup manufacturer, a recycler, a composter, and a hauler. We'll go into more details about these parties in a little bit. The issues that they are negotiating involve creating a pilot study to test whether used paper coffee cups can be composted or recycled. And so they have this context of this pilot study that they're creating, and the questions that they're answering about it include the timing of when the pilot should start, if external parties should be allowed to observe, such as the media or the community, what percentage should be recycled or composted, etc. So it is based on a real-world used paper coffee cup value chain. This is what I did my SDM master's thesis on. It was a study that started with Starbucks, but then extended into the rest of the consumer packaged good food industry. So it's now being nicely continued with the Paper Recovery Alliance. The issues involved in this role play do involve both environmental concerns as well as business strategy interests. Each party in this role play is given individual points to indicate that party's preferences and priorities. So any given participant playing a role would know what their values are, their party's values are, based on these points. They can tell both within one issue what's their favorite alternative, as well as among the issues, which issues are more important. All 5 parties were independently told that they get a bonus if the pilot system that they're negotiating about saves a certain level of CO2. And there's 1 point maximizing agreement. So if we take all the individual scores that an individual makes in this negotiation and add them up for the 5 people negotiating at that table, that's the agreement total, or the table score. And there's 1 that's the maximum. But this, importantly, in this case, I designed it not to be the environmental optimal, forcing the 5 parties to make a choice whether they wanted to maximize their value or maximize the environment, to see what would happen. Does model use impact the process and/or outcome of sustainability negotiations? Does model authorship? If so, how? So these are the research questions for the cup game experiment. First of all, we have to start with, will negotiators even use a model while they're negotiating a science-intensive dispute, such as a sustainability negotiation? They may not. Does model use influence the outcome of the negotiation? Does model authorship influence the outcome? Does model use influence the negotiation process? And does model authorship influence the process? The measurements for outcome and process are these listed here. So for outcome, it's the favorable agreements, what I mentioned before. Oh, sorry, I haven't mentioned this before. Favorable agreements, which are the value maximizing and the most environmental. I started to explain that the different parties have these table scores, and there's 1 that's the highest. The most environmental are a set of agreements that reduce the amount of CO2 the most. And as I did say before, the 2 are mutually exclusive. So the parties have to choose between maximizing their value and maximizing the environmental impact. The agreement value, or the table scores, that again is the sum of the individual parties' score for the given agreement. The value distribution among the parties, so who got what amount of value. For process, it's negotiation duration, or how long did it take. And in manner of model use, that means how did each table that used a model use that model? There are different ways, and we'll talk about which ones we observed here in this study. So the experimental setup for the cup game is dividing between giving an expert given model and not giving an expert given model. So we wanted to see what would happen if we gave the parties a model, the tables of parties, and if we did not. Regardless of whether they received those set of equations that form the life cycle assessment, all the necessary data for the life cycle assessment was available to treatment and control. So regardless of whether they got the equations, they got the data that was needed. However, no individual party had all the data. Each party had approximately one piece of the data that went into this life cycle assessment. So in order to actually use the model, they would have had to share that information, that data, with each other. This is the very simple life cycle assessment that's used in the cup game. I've X'd out all the values just in case you happen to play it one day. It is still being used at classes at MIT. So I want you to have a fun time playing if you do. The 5 parties are here. We'll start in the middle with the coffee shop because they are the convening party, the party around which this system is centered, and the party that is convening the others to address the problem. So they are the coffee shop. They buy clean unused cups from the cup manufacturer. They put coffee into them, they sell them to their customers, and their customers mostly leave the stores and drink the coffee, out in the city, at their offices, in their cars, and throw them away elsewhere. So that's one of the first challenges. For the context of this pilot study that the 5 parties are negotiating, they concentrate on the in-store situation where a consumer drinks coffee from a paper cup and throws it away within the store. So they have to engage in customer education in order to encourage customers to place the cups in the appropriate bin within the store. So if you see down in the left-hand corner, XXX tons of used cups are collected per $1,000 spent on customer education. Once the customers put the used paper coffee cups into the bins in the coffee shop, in the context of this pilot, they are sent then to 2 different facilities via a hauling truck. So it's a hauling company that runs essentially garbage trucks that can take material from one place to another. Of course, these trucks have a limit. They can take XXX tons per truckload, and they also emit CO2 while they're driving. The 2 different facilities are different distances away. Compost facility in one direction and the recycling facility in the other. The compost facility saves a certain amount of CO2 per tons composted, and the recycling facility saves a different amount per ton recycled. The tables of negotiators that received the life cycle assessment received a spreadsheet with the equations for this life cycle assessment. The tables that did not receive it just received the data. I've had 74 negotiating tables play this game. 53% received a model. I gave them the equations for the model, and 47% did not receive a model. So here you see that in the vertical stripes for the given and the horizontal for the not given. However, interestingly, 80% of the tables that have played used a model, leaving only 20% that didn't use a model. So if we split that gray section that's on the right-hand side of the second bar into the 2 ends of the third bar, still equaling 20%, with the blue bit in the middle being 80%, we're setting ourselves up for a convenient nomenclature to use throughout the rest of the study. By overlaying the vertical bars and the horizontal bars, we're starting to see that some tables, did not use a model they were given. Those are the gray on the left side that have the vertical lines, and some did not give a model and also didn't create one. So those are the gray on the very right-hand side with the horizontal stripes. So the nomenclature I use throughout the rest of the talk is not used. I grouped the 2 together, not used. Whether they ignored a model they were given or just didn't create one, I'm considering them to be the same category. Future research can distinguish between the 2, but for now they're just one category. Tables that use the model they were given are depicted here in this darker blue in the bottom bar. Tables that co-created their own model are in green. So let's look at some results. A higher proportion of tables creating their own model reached favorable agreements. So this is in direct answer to the question of, does model use or model authorship influence the outcome? And remember, again, favorable agreements are those that are either most environmental or point maximizing, and they are mutually exclusive. So here in the plot on the bottom right, we have on the vertical axis there, it's the number of tables, and it's normalized by the number of tables in a given category. And we see that the co-created in green, 44% of them reached a favorable agreement, whereas only 25% that used the given model reached a favorable agreement. And this difference is statistically significant at a 90-degree level. Sorry, a 90% level. Higher proportions of tables that created their own environments reached these favorable agreements, but what else do we know about them? Of these tables that reached a favorable agreement, half of them that had co-created a model chose a most environmental favorable agreement. So the other half chose the point maximum. Only 37% of the tables that used the given model chose the most environmental, and 25% of the not used. So only a quarter of the tables that did not use a model chose the most environmental. So we're seeing here that the co-created tables, more of them picked a most environmental favorable agreement. Another way to look at this is to think about, okay, so what sort of agreements did they reach? Did most of the tables reach agreements no other table had reached? Or did they mostly concentrate themselves on a set of, or subset of the total possible agreements? So the first line of this table is the percentage of final agreements that are unique. For the used given, it's only 38%. And for the co-created, it's 41. But for the not used, it's almost half. So almost half of the tables that did not use a model reached an agreement that was unique. So looking at that kind of in the inverse way, it's the number of duplicate agreements. There are much more duplicate agreements for the used given and created own than for the not used. That most model using teams reached agreements within a small subset of the possible agreements does lend some credibility and some further support to the finding that co-creating tables created more favorable agreements. However, if I wanted to look at how well each of the tables explored the entire solution space, so the area of all possible agreements, sometimes called the trade space, I would have needed to record data about which agreements they considered while negotiating, and unfortunately I didn't do that. I think it would be a wonderful next study, and maybe one of you listening would be interested in doing that. I think it's absolutely something that would tell us a lot more about what's happening when negotiators use a model at the negotiating table. So let's look at our next measure for outcomes, and that's the table scores. So here we have in the light blue in the plot on the left-hand column, we have the group that used the LCA, whether or not they created it themselves. So this is model use compared to not model use. And in the gray bar on the right-hand side, it's not model, it's not using an LCA, so no model use. Used and not used, they have significantly different variances in their table score. There was not much difference for authorship. So model authorship, co-creating versus using a given model did not matter with table scores. Note that for this plot, there is one table that did not use a model, and they also did not reach agreement. So they got a score of 0 for their table. It's a very viable outcome in a negotiation. Sometimes you don't reach agreement. So it is included in the analysis, though I zoomed into the part of the graph that doesn't show it so that we would be able to see more detail in this upper part of the graph. Moving on to our next measure of outcome, an important thing to consider is value distribution. How does the model or the authorship of the model influence how the parties are able to retain or attract value to their role at the table? So looking at this graph, I'll walk through it. There are 5 columns, one for each of the parties. It starts with the coffee, the cup, the recycle, the composter, and the hauler. Each of those columns has a set of 3 different box plots. The darker is where they use the given LCA. The middle gray is, and the middle position, is they used a co-created LCA or they co-created their own. And the lighter gray right-hand side of each column is not using a model. Along the y-axis, it's the score overage. And what this means is that, as I said, each party has individual points for the different alternatives within the issues. They also have a point threshold, meaning they can't join an agreement unless that agreement gives them a certain number of points, and that threshold varies by party. So they're meant not to share that, so they don't share that with each other. So each party and each person playing that party is responsible to make sure that the agreement they're talking about has enough value for their particular party so that it's good for them. The score overage is how much better they did than their threshold. So if we see here 1.0 means they got just enough value to join the agreement and that's it. 2.0 means they got twice as much value as they needed to join the agreement. And you see in some cases, some individuals got over 2.5 times what they needed to. You also see in the recycler, there's one person who got below their 1.0 threshold, meaning that one person who played the cup game either by accident or maybe got pressured into an agreement that did not give them enough value for their role. So they really should not have agreed to the agreement that was agreed to by their table. However, this also happens in real life. Sometimes we either make mistakes while we're negotiating or we get overpowered. So again, this is a viable data point, but it's not what anyone's going for. Everyone's trying to get enough value for their own party out of the negotiation. So taking a look at how the value is distributed, we've got the coffee, the cup, the recycler, the composter, and the hauler in columns left to right. If we look at how those big groups are allocated, so in other words, how the 3 box plots for coffee are positioned relative to the 3 for cup, relative to the 3 for recycling, relative to the 3 for composting, and relative to the 3 for hauling. We see that the cup and the composter do better on average than the other 3 roles. That means these parties have a relatively easy time reaching agreement. Almost everything works for them, or very few things don't work for them. So they're gaining in a very large set of agreements. And that's not so true for the coffee and for the hauler. They've got a tighter set of needs that they want out of this agreement. So they have to be a little more careful in what they agree to. So that's the model use, the value distribution. If we look at in terms of, does model use matter and does model authorship matter? For model use, we can look at the left 2 bars together compared to right bar. So it's a little hard to do visually, but basically we can see that the 50% bar in each of those box plots is approximately in the same place, with the exception of the coffee and the hauler, or 2 of the bars that are model use. When we look at model authorship, that's where we zoom into the left box plot in each column. So we look at the coffee and we see that the used given has a lower 50% bar than the co-created. In other words, the coffee maker does a little bit better when their table co-creates a model. Conversely, if we look over at the hauler does worse when their party co-creates the model. That's the medium gray bar in the middle for the hauler. The other 3 parties, the bars are visually very close to each other, and in all cases, they're statistically close to each other. So we can pretty much say that neither model use nor model authorship alters the value distribution of the parties or among the parties. Turning now to the process measures. So does model use or model authorship influence the process? If we look at the plot on the right here, we've got 3 columns, one for used given, one for co-created, and one for LCA not used. The vertical axis is time in minutes, how long it took them to negotiate an agreement. Very, very importantly, the co-created and used given do not have statistically significant variances or medians. So in other words, statistically speaking, it took no longer for a table to co-create their own model than to use a model that was given to them. And that's particularly important because, kind of thinking about it, you might think it might take them a little longer to come up with a model than to sit down and use a model that was already created. When we compare the model use to no model use, so in other words, the used given and the co-created one category compared to not model use, we see that they do have a significant variance. And then we compare them each to not using a model, compare the use given to not using a model, and compare the co-created to not using a model. Those are also have statistically significant variances. The other process model we talked about was how do the parties use the model at the table while they're negotiating. So one manner that we observed is through it's called verifying an agreement. And a good example of a quote that describes this is in the words of a participant. He or she says, "We looked at it to make sure we had the right decisions to trigger the incentive," and that's the bonus for reaching the CO2 savings goal. So in other words, they negotiated, they came up with an agreement, and then they said, oh, let's check it and see if we're going to get our bonus. They negotiated the package, tentatively agreed to it, and then checked the model to make sure they could fully commit to it. So that's one manner. We call that verifying a tentative agreement. Another manner of model use we call test alternatives. So in this case, here's a quote. Who's the cup maker, his spreadsheet kind of became our fact checking, or like a litmus test tool. When we started looking at different proposals, we started looking at the cup maker spreadsheet to see which were above the threshold. So this table, while they were figuring out negotiation packages, proposing like, let's say option A on issue 1 and option B on issue 2, they checked each one of those against the model to see what the CO2 savings would be. The third type is self-benefit. The model, as I said, was given to one party, the cup maker. And at some tables, not very often, but at some tables, the cup maker didn't share this. And this is despite their directions encouraging them to share. It was totally their choice. This is one of the nice things about a serious game, is the participants' interactions are left unfettered. This participant, and a handful of them, chose not to share their model. A typical quote for this was, he, the cup maker, just went around and asked us for numbers to estimate the CO2 per ton that we would reduce. So we thought maybe there was some sort of spreadsheet he was working with already. We don't know if he was calculating it separately or not. So in other words, this cup maker went around and asked each party for their data. So remember, the data were distributed among the parties, received that information, put it into his model, and figured out what that CO2 savings would be for the agreement. When comparing how well these different manners of model use performed, tables that use these different manners, how well they performed, we compare the verify a tentative agreement and test alternatives. So in this plot, we've got a column of a box plot for the verify tentative agreement, and the column on the right is for testing alternatives. The y-axis is the table scores. And it's important to note that there's a cap. The absolute possible maximum score was 765. So no table could do better than that just by the structure of the game. So that's why there's such a hard cap in the plot. It's very notable here that the test alternatives on the right-hand side in the turquoise, their test scores skewed higher than the orange bar, which is the verify tentative agreement, did on the left. When they tested alternatives, the table scores tended to skew higher, meaning more tables reached agreements that had higher value. So we see that model use does impact the outcome and process of sustainability negotiations. Our first question was, will negotiators use a model in a science-intensive negotiation? And we found yes. We found that actually they did use a model. 80% of them used a model, even if they had to create it themselves. Does model use and/or model authorship influence the negotiated outcome? Co-creating teams reach more favorable agreements, and that, again, is the mutually exclusive, most environmental, and point maximizing. Model use increased the variance in the table score value. Model authorship did not. Interestingly, the model use did not alter an important component of negotiations, the value distribution among the parties. Does model use and/or model authorship influence the negotiation process? Neither model use nor model authorship lengthen the negotiation duration statistically. Model use did influence the variance in the negotiation duration. Model authorship did not. And if you'll recall, it did not take any more time for the set of tables that co-created their own model to negotiate than the tables that received a model already provided. So that's an important characteristic, because one of the reasons for abandoning a negotiation or for not using one in the first place is concerns about how long it will take and therefore how much it'll cost. So it's very important finding that model use does not necessarily lengthen the negotiation duration. We also asked whether model authorship or use influences how they use the model, which manner they use it in. And what we found instead is that there was no difference really in how they were given, but it was really important that the two manners of model use were not the same as each other in terms of how their scores turned out. So tables using the model to test alternatives had scores that skewed higher than tables using the model to verify a tentative agreement. Now let's bring these back into the real world and real world negotiations and decisions. So the advantages of using a model and of co-creating the model are that for using a model, it does not necessarily increase the negotiation duration. And again, this is particularly important to encourage a negotiated approach. Co-creating a model, when co-creating the model rather than using an expert-given model, it can increase the likelihood of achieving a favorable agreement. And again, this will depend, but what the favorable agreement is in any given context will be context specific. So that'll have to be determined on a context basis. But in this study, we found that the favorable agreements for in this context were better and more frequently achieved by model creating tables. Co-creating a model does not necessarily lengthen the duration compared to using an existing model. When using a model to test alternatives rather than to verify a tentative agreement, you can increase the likelihood of gaining more value. So not only whether you use a model or who creates it, but how you use it can be very important. So if we were talking about applying these in real-world negotiations, we know that it's not always possible to have the parties co-create a model. Imagine the COP21 that just happened in Paris in 2015, or the Minamata Convention about the chemical mercury. These are UN negotiations with 197 odd countries participating and many NGOs, and it's a really large convention. Both of them are really large conventions. So having the parties co-create a model is probably not very realistic in those contexts during the actual week to 2 week long negotiations. They can possibly do that in the lead up and the preparations for, but in terms of during the actual negotiations, they're probably better using expert models, expert made models. This one pictured here is called En-ROADS. It's developed by Climate Interactive, MIT Sloan School, John Sturman. Many of you may know him. This model is based on system dynamics, and it shows, or actually it allows its users to test different approaches to energy policy and then see their projected outcome on things like the average global temperature or average global change in temperature, some economic measures, and other factors that are important to considering large-scale policy on this. En-ROADS has a sister model called C-ROADS, which is geared more towards the COP21 approach. But models such as these can be very helpful for enduring sustainability negotiations. I'd like to thank my doctoral committee, Starbucks for funding part of the Cup game, my colleagues and mentors in IDSS, DUSP, Sloan, elsewhere at MIT and Harvard, of course the SDM program, and everyone who took a turn as a negotiator creating a better end of life for used paper coffee cups. These are the participants, and I obviously couldn't have done it without you. Thank you. Here's a list of references and my contact information. I'd love to hear questions and stay in touch.
Thank you, Ellen. We have several questions. Going to take them out of order. Some of them seem a little more foundational and I think would set a good pathway. The first one is, why do you think it is that co-creating models is more effective?
So I think and we need more research to fully test these mechanisms, but given what I've seen, what I observed while I was running these experiments and what I've read in the literature, I think it's trust and information sharing, and those two are related to each other. The more stakeholders share information with each other, the more that lends them to trust each other, and the more trust they have, the more information they're likely to share. And obviously, if we've got a situation where we've got a model that we're trying to use, like an expert given one, and parties withhold data, you can't very easily use the model. The same is very true when you're co-creating.
If I'm in a situation where other stakeholders and I need to make a collective decision, how can we go about creating a model together?
That's a great question. There are several approaches. One that comes to mind is using a neutral facilitator team. That's how collaborative modeling is very often done. Sometimes it's called, collective model building or collaborative modeling. There are consulting teams and researchers who do this for a living. Very often it's using system dynamics as the modeling language or the modeling approach, but other types are very possible as well. There's also something called joint fact finding, or JFF. It's not specific to just models. It can also include just regular study, other types of research studies to determine information that's pertinent to a decision. But I would recommend either of those two approaches.
Okay, thank you. Next is, why is systems thinking important to co-creating models?
Systems thinking is, as this audience very likely knows, very inclusive of the interrelationships among both the system components as well as its stakeholders. It's looking at the dynamics within the system and always asking where the boundary is and what happens if we move the edges of that boundary. And seeing the system from different perspectives, different stakeholders' perspectives. And all those are very important in co-creating a model. When co-creating a model together, the group has to think about what exactly are they modeling? Where are the boundaries of it? And how does that model become credible, salient, and legitimate to the people who are creating it? So in other words, does it reflect their view of the world, their view of the system? Does it reflect their view of the world? Does it help them answer the questions that are important to them? And is it made by a group that's, is it made believable? And in this case, often that's by a group, but in this case, it's them. So I think systems thinking is very, very important to co-creating models.
Did the study participants trade off point values and environmental benefit? If so, I'd like to get a sense of how the participants felt trading off with a unit point value, trading off a unit point value with a unit environmental benefit.
Okay, so that's the base of that question is really interesting, and I'll just correct a little bit of it to explain to address my answer. So the participants, when they received their instructions at the setup of the game, they received a particular role, and then that role had a table of each of the 5 issues and then each of the alternatives possible under those issues. Next to each of those alternatives was a point value. So yes, in a sense, to the way your question was asked, yes, they were directly trading off a certain number of points for a better environmental outcome compared to a better, let's say, business outcome. But what I wanted to clarify is that they actually did get points for the environmental as well. So, on some parties' score sheets, they specifically valued the environment higher than, let's say, something that might be perceived as a more business approach. So in that case, those parties were point-wise rewarded for their environment. In terms of how did it show up in the trade-off, you asked how did they feel when they were making that trade-off. When I interviewed participants afterwards, I asked them a very similar question to the one you asked, and they said that they didn't necessarily realize that that's what they were doing, because they were looking at their point sheet as a priority structure. And so in the case of a party that maybe values the environment but is more constrained from a business point of view, they needed to do what their constraint was, needed to meet their business need. So they didn't necessarily view that trade-off as so harsh, if that makes sense. And in the cup game, all 5 of the parties very expressly do value the environment. It's written throughout their text. It's an important piece of each of their businesses. but in particularly one party's situation, they are more business constrained about how much they can actually address the environmental concerns without folding as a business. So I hope that addresses your question.
Okay. The next question is, first a comment. I'm surprised at how many folks built models. Were the subjects predisposed to model use? For example, were they STM students?
So that is very possible. So we were surprised too, my advisor and I, in terms of how many groups built models. The participants were a majority, from a large perspective, the majority of the students were MIT students in general, mostly from the Sloan School, so mostly MBAs and Sloan Fellows. There were some that were from DUSP and from, which is the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, as well as other parts of MIT. And of course, because it's the Sloan School, there were certainly STM students. So it is possible that my sample is biased given, the fact that these were all MIT, well, mostly MIT students. I did have others who played that were not MIT students, other professionals, but they were also educated professionals from scientific fields. So it's possible that if we had people from off the street, we might get a different outcome. But I was studying specifically how sustainability negotiations can use models. And in that case, I made the assumption, and I still think it's valid, that the people who are likely to be doing that in the real world are themselves educated and are themselves cognizant of the different physical and scientific disciplines that go into studying sustainability. So I do think my sample is reasonable given what I was trying to study, which is sustainability negotiators who are professionals themselves.
Great. Next question. Any comment on the perception that experts who build expert models might be biased?
That's a very good question. And there's a saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And some of the reasons why they're wrong include the model bias, model maker bias. So that is something to be aware of. And when assessing models, a useful schema is considering the credibility, salience, and legitimacy. Credibility, salience, and legitimacy are attributes that individuals ascribe to information, models, and other decision tools. A decision maker or negotiator would rate a model high in credibility if he or she thinks that it was accurate, valid, and scientifically sound. A high salience rating indicates that the negotiator thinks the model is relevant to the question at hand. A high legitimacy rating indicates that the negotiator thinks the model allows for and is unbiased in its treatment of different viewpoints and values.
Great. Next question is, can you tell us a bit about the treat and the control populations in terms of size, profiles, etc.?
Sure. So the treatment were those who were given the model, and the control group were those who were not given a model. There were 39 tables of 5 negotiators each in the treatment, and there were 35 tables of 5 negotiators each in the control, the not given a model. And these were evenly split within that population I was just describing, of mostly MIT students, but also some professionals not from MIT, but everyone had at least a college degree.
Great. We have a few more minutes for questions, so if you have any, please type them right into the chat section or send them to me at the email address in the chat, lslavin@mit.edu. While we're waiting, I would just like to remind everyone that we will send you a link to the recording and the slides within about a week. And our next webinar is being held off cycle. It will be held on a Wednesday, April 19th, same time, noon to 1 p.m. Eastern. And it will be delivered by STM alumnus Aravind Ratnam. Some of you may remember that was scheduled in January, but postponed because of the blizzard that shut down MIT and most of the state. Arvind is the head of connected vehicle products at Wind River, and the title of his presentation is Adventures in Strategy, Systems Thinking, and Business Systems in the Real Corporate World. And we hope you can join us for that. We will send you a link to the registration info when we send you the link to the recording and slides for today's webinar. Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions right now. If something occurs to you after we conclude the webinar, please feel free to contact Dr. Czaika at the email address on your screen. Ellen, on behalf of SGM and MIT, thank you very much for delivering a really interesting and important webinar. And we wish everybody a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois, and thank you for listening, and thanks to SDM.